Welcome back to Weekend Live. Well, joining me to discuss the day's political news is Evan Mulholland from the Institute of Public Affairs and Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute. Hello to you both. Let's get straight into it. Big news out of Victoria today. The Premier Daniel Andrews has confirmed that he and his senior staff will provide their phone records to the inquiry into hotel quarantine. Evan, we'll start with you. How critical is this? And this could potentially hold the key to finding out exactly who hired the private security guards.
Well, Daniel Andrews just put Victoria into another 4 weeks of state of disaster, and that's an apt way of Andrews' leadership at the moment. I mean, Graham Ashton blew the lid on this idea that there was some sort of collective assumption about the use of private security, and all the power to Sky News' Peter Credlin and her journalism for exposing this. I've worked in government before, and there's no such thing as a collective assumption in the public service or ministerial accountability. Those decisions are made. And on the further pushback of easing restrictions, that's another kick in the guts for small business, another kick in the guts for Victorian families, another kick in the guts for their mental health. What I found even more astonishing about today's press conference is that the Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, said, who knows, in regards to whether Victoria could get to under 5 average cases a day. It's now clear they must front the press conference tomorrow and give a plan for the easing of restrictions, because what they're pursuing is an elimination strategy. We've estimated that will $319 billion in lost economic output. They should move to a targeted medical capacity approach based on proportionate, targeted effects where you can have target the vulnerable and have high amounts of contact tracing like we have here in New South Wales. And I think Victoria is looking at New South Wales and seeing cases flare up and then go back down and thinking, why can't we have the system we have in New South Wales? And those are the kind of questions that need to be put to Daniel Andrews, and then he needs to answer.
Yeah, well, if Brett Sutton doesn't know, the government doesn't know, I don't think it gives businesses much hope of moving forward and reopening. Ebony, a big development today, as we've been saying, the phone records, text messages, they will be handed over to the hotel quarantine inquiry. How important is it for the public to get answers as to exactly who hired the private security guards?
And Dan Andrews has said now that he's had that request, he will hand over that. Only more transparency and accountability that we've seen than we saw from the Berejiklian government in New South Wales during the Ruby Princess fiasco and inquiry, and it's more transparency and accountability than we've seen from several Commonwealth government ministers recently, including Minister Alan Tudge, whose behaviour has been described as criminal by the courts after he refused to comply with a court order there. So, look, I think it's important. I think it's important that governments are both accountable and transparent, and Dan Andrews has agreed to hand over those records as well as his senior staff doing the same. So, he'll do what he's been asked.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see how this one develops. Let's talk about, of course, next Sunday was touted, as you said, Evan, as a big day that was meant to be Victorians and Melbourne moving out of lockdown, but that now appears increasingly unlikely, as confirmed by Daniel Andrews. At what point do you think, Evan, that the government has health impact of this rather than the case numbers? Is it a fine line?
It is, and what the ongoing uncertainty around opening up, Victorians are losing hope. Small business owners are losing hope, and we're seeing from coroner's reports, we've seen from hospital statistics that there is a higher, increased amount of mental health issues as a result of this lockdown. Victoria has now the longest lockdown in the world, longer than Wuhan, and there are so many businesses that will never recover. We're seeing a greatly disproportionate impact between small business and big business. Big business is doing relatively okay. Small businesses, there will be businesses that do not come back. If you go through the Melbourne CBD, if you go through Chapel Street, every second business has a full lease sign. It's just heartbreaking, and I commend the over 100 came out today begging the Andrews government to ease restrictions, to give us a plan, because while there is no plan, there is no hope.
I guess the key word is hope. You're right, Ebony. The mental health impact for a number of Victorians, business owners, as we've just been saying here, now this hope has been dashed. They had been probably gearing up to open next week, but now they're not going to be able to. I mean, how difficult do you think this is for a number of owners?
Look, it's extremely difficult, and Victoria is obviously bearing the worst of the brunt of this second wave and its economic impacts, but it's certainly not alone in terms of businesses who might never recover. We're seeing that right across the economy. And, of course, we can't lose sight of the fact that the Andrews government isn't doing this for no reason. We have had a second outbreak in Victoria. Lives were at stake, and all of these measures are implemented ultimately to save lives. And I think there are a few people they might want to see an easing of restrictions who would not like to see Victoria go through a third wave if the Andrews government opens the economy too early and because of political pressure rather than being driven by the health advice. So it is a fine line that the Andrews government has to toe. But I also think it points to the wider problems facing the Australian economy and the border restrictions between states. It is important that National Cabinet develop nationally consistent guidelines and restrictions where there are outbreaks or hotspots, because we don't have anything nationally, and if we are going to open up all the state government, all the state borders, Australians need to understand how that's going to be implemented, what those restrictions are, and business needs to know that as well, and we still have nothing.
You're right. The problem is, I guess, Ebony, is that some states like Western Australia, they don't want to sign up to a hotspot model and approach, but certainly Western Australia has been more stubborn on that. Let's move on now. Of course, big week, federal budget week, tax incentives a major part of that. Evan, how do you think that the federal government's budget has been received so far?
I think it's been received all right. I think the punters know that these kind of actions need to be taken, but I think the budget reveals how much the economy has been disfigured by this lockdown-induced COVID pandemic. Modelling we did at the IPA has found that gross Commonwealth debt will peak at $2.05 trillion by the year 2045 and won't be paid back till the year 2080. That means no budget surplus till the year 2046. Research we had out today shows that 3,500 private sector jobs a day have been lost since March. That's 607,000. All the while, 20,000 new bureaucrats, public servants have been hired. Shared sacrifice. But what we're seeing is small business has been absolutely smashed disproportionately to big business, and a real Liberal government wouldn't be subsidising different parts of the economy, subsidising the wages or subsidising employment of workers. They would be doing things like carving small business out of the Fair Work Act to give small business a leg up. They would be cutting red tape and cutting taxes and cutting company tax in order to boost the economy. And why I think moving forward of stage 2 tax cuts is appropriate. They could have gone the whole swath and brought forward stage 3, which would have given a real boost to the economy. So I think cutting red tape and cutting taxes needs to be the approach of this Liberal government.
It was interesting with stage 3, the Treasurer was saying today that the government did not bring it forward, but that they still are absolutely fully committed to it after the next election. Ebony, do you think this policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was really telling that the Treasurer said that they didn't bring those forward, the stage 3 tax cuts, because essentially he admitted they had no bang for buck in terms of stimulus. That's because the stage 3 tax cuts, like stage 2, are primarily directed at high-income earners, and the Australia Institute has done some polling on the reception of the budget, and Evan's right. A majority of people think the budget will be good for the economy, but interestingly, 30% of people think that they will be personally worse off. So a lot of people think that they personally will miss out here. But concerningly for the Treasurer, about 3/4 of people said that they intended to save some or all of their income tax cuts. Any dollar saved is basically a dollar wasted in terms of stimulus. That's dollars that won't be spent in the economy to boost GDP, boost growth, or boost, employment. So that will be of huge value, because those income tax cuts, along with the business tax incentives, which are much, much larger, as really the two big ticket items of this budget, and the Treasurer needs every dollar to be working hard. And the real risk here is all of these subsidies to business and income tax cuts are poorly directed, not where we need the economic growth to be or where the biggest hits to the economy have been. So definitely we need to see more targeting, and I think the budget's a really big missed opportunity here.
Quick final word from both of you in regards to Labor's budget reply. Childcare really the centrepiece for Labor's policy here. Evan, how realistic do you think is Labor's plans for childcare?
It's not, and what we know from childcare reforms of both Liberal and Labor over the past 10 years is that more subsidies for childcare, more money into childcare does not equal lower prices for families. The is red tape, and that tracks back to 2012 when the Gillard government slapped minimum tertiary requirements on childcare workers under the guise of the National Quality Framework. This means that childcare workers need to get a 3 to 4 year tertiary degree in order to become a childcare worker, and that means that we've estimated that they'll have to work about 300 hours in order to break even on that cost. The sector is clogged up with red tape. It's created a vicious cycle of red tape where more red tape has equaled higher prices, which has equaled more subsidies, which has equaled more demand, which has equaled higher prices again. I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, and that's exactly what Anthony Albanese's childcare policy does.
Ebony, final word from you. We still don't have the costings of the policy. Scott Morrison says that more details are needed. But how realistic do you think Labor's plan is for childcare?
Government's just delivered a budget with $1 trillion in debt coming down the line. So I think we can put the issue of cost to the side. What the real issue here is economic growth relies on three things. It's either productivity, population, or participation. Now, obviously, the Australian economy isn't going to see any population growth anytime soon with migration virtually shut down. So participation becomes even more important, and that's why childcare is important, and that's why I think it was really smart both politically but more so economically for Labor to focus on childcare here. It is a participation issue. The economy will grow if more women can participate in it, and at the moment, childcare is a barrier to women's participation in the workforce. We've got some of the highest childcare costs in the OECD, and Labor has a plan, and I think was right, to focus on trying to fix that affordability problem for as it can, and that will lead to increased GDP over the long term, as well as short-term stimulus if we can get more women back into the workforce sooner. So it's not only smart politically, it's very smart to focus on childcare.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
Wages are growing at their slower, sustained pace.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.